Today, you'll be hearing from Ann Mei Chang, who leads Candid in harnessing the precision of data, the power of technology, and the compassion of the social sector to increase its collective ability to do good during these unprecedented times of disruption and need. She is a leading expert on social innovation and the author of Lean Impact: How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. Mimi Stiles founded Measure in 2015 to promote the use of evidence-based projects and tools to tell real-life stories behind the numbers. As a catalyst for systems change, Measure has grown to fully operational nonprofit social enterprise that provides free data support to powerful Black and Brown-led communities. So far, the organization has provided over 3,000 free data support. Please join me in welcoming Ann Mei Chang to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. The year is 2020. COVID is raging around the globe. Here in the United States, we're confronting a national reckoning with racism. There's this incredible surge of energy and interest among donors and nonprofits alike to take bold action. Foundations and corporations are piling on to make big public financial commitments to fight racial injustice. They want to partner with BIPOC-led organizations that have the trust of their communities. But there's little response. At the same time, small community-based nonprofits across the country are desperately seeking resources so that they can step up to meet this moment. They're looking for new sources of funding that can amplify their work. But there's also little response. Across the country, the same dynamic repeated itself over and over again. What happened? How could funders and nonprofits both be so actively motivated and mobilized to find each other in this historic moment and yet fail? Alas, this is only a small microcosm of a long broken system that has been holding back our progress in achieving racial equity. Today, I'd like to start by digging into the underlying problems that led us to have this scenario. Then I'll talk about our vision for how Candid's tools can enable a whole new way of working. Finally, I'll share how funders and nonprofits have used these tools to drive real, lasting progress in advancing racial equity. Let's start with the problems. In their report, Mismatched, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity found that funding for racial equity and racial justice has fallen far short of the size and scope that's needed to make real progress on these entrenched issues. Not only has there not been enough funding, but we haven't been funding the right organizations for the right purposes. What many have considered work on racial justice has in fact merely been offsetting the effects of an unjust system rather than investing to change that system itself. In the summer of 2020, in the fury amidst the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, there was a growing recognition that the progress we thought we'd been making was merely a mirage. People started scrambling to find better solutions. As a result, we saw two major and sudden shifts in the philanthropic world. First, funders started to make racial equity a much higher priority in both their strategy and their giving. Second, they recognized the need to direct more of their funding to BIPOC-led organizations who have the trust of their communities and know what works and what doesn't work. At Candid, we received a deluge of calls, emails, and inquiries from people desperate to connect with such organizations and unable to find them. So why were we so unprepared? Unfortunately, this powerful moment ran into an antiquated system that has long struggled to connect funders who have the financial resources and nonprofits who do the real work, particularly those nonprofits that are BIPOC-led. 3 problems particularly stand out to me. First, an over-reliance on traditional networks. Second, poor data, including on demographics. And third, the burden that we place on nonprofits in our efforts to gather that data. Let's start with networks. In the absence of good data, both funders and nonprofits tend to rely on their existing networks. Funders have the financial resources to advance social change, and generally, they want to connect with the nonprofits who are best positioned to do that work. So, how do you think they do that? Well, a recent Hewlett Foundation study found that 89% of them simply asked their peers. Does that sound like an echo chamber to you? Well, of course, with this approach, funders are unlikely to find organizations that don't already look a lot like them. And that often means BIPOC-led nonprofits. So when foundations and corporations came under pressure to fulfill those very public commitments they'd made to racial injustice, their limited connections to the communities who are most affected meant that those networks of theirs weren't of much use. Instead, they started to turn to the few Black leaders and Black-led organizations that they already knew, such as our colleagues at Echoing Green. Now, although Echoing Green's own mission is to invest in early-stage social entrepreneurs, funders started to ask them for help in redistributing grants for them, given the strong networks that they had already created in doing their work along the way. They had those connections to diverse communities. This ultimately caused Echoing Green to have to spin up an entirely new work stream to get the money to where they knew it needed to go. Of course, having funders continue to lean on Black and brown leaders to do their work is neither appropriate, sustainable, or scalable. On the nonprofit side, another complicating factor is that those community-based nonprofits often don't have the resources to invest in broad visibility for their work. The big brand name nonprofits have no problems connecting with funders. Generally speaking, the larger and more established the organization, the more likely they are to have a whole department dedicated to fundraising and marketing. On the other hand, those smaller nonprofits might not even have a website, let alone fundraising or communications or PR staff. According to the Building Movement Project's Race to Lead report, leaders of color are more likely to attribute fundraising challenges to a lack of access. This is particularly true when it comes to raising money from individuals and foundations, because having the right networks can be essential there. This severely limits the ability of BIPOC-led organizations to effectively fundraise. So you can imagine that when both funders and community-based nonprofits suddenly wanted to ramp up their work together on racial equity, this system massively failed. Let's turn to the second problem. We all know that good intentions aren't enough. When funders became galvanized to address racial equity, they quickly ran into major roadblocks. To start with, how many organizations in their portfolios were actually BIPOC-led? Most honestly didn't know. They knew about the work they were funding, but not who was doing that work. Of course, when they started to also look for more BIPOC-led organizations to partner with, they also drew a blank. Even at Candid, 2 years ago, the demographic data we had on nonprofits was incredibly limited. In 2020, the Packard Foundation had a wake-up call on multiple fronts that I think was quite similar to what many other foundations were also experiencing at the time. First, they felt a lot of pressure to be transparent about the demographics of the organizations that they were funding in their portfolio. And they simply didn't have the information. Second, they wanted that data themselves to inform their efforts to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in their own grant making. Third, their grantee perception report showed that nonprofits that were led by people of color rated their experience working with the foundation much lower than their white-led peers. As a result of all this, Packard Foundation recognized how important it was to better understand who it was funding. In addition to funders, advocacy groups, journalists, and researchers all wanted to know who was getting funded so they could shine a light on the gaps. They all came up short. With this sudden heightened demand for demographic data, guess what happened? Well, everyone started to bombard nonprofits with requests to fill out their own custom surveys on demographics using different formats, different definitions, and different slices. This put a huge burden on nonprofits to collect and submit data over and over again, diverting attention from their critical programs at a critical time. Of course, while this was just a minor irritation for those large established nonprofits, the burden was significantly worse for exactly the organizations that funders wanted to reach the most, those smaller, under-resourced, BIPOC-led nonprofits. As it turned out, many of the funders who were fielding all those demographic surveys were exactly the same funders who were committed to reducing the reporting burden on nonprofits. Truly ironic, huh? Now, while this flurry of demographic data collection came in this atypical crush, every day, nonprofits have to grapple with onerous grant applications and reporting requirements that involves largely regurgitating similar data in different ways for different funders. In a recent study, the Technology Association of Grantmakers found that 39% of the questions in foundation grant applications were largely similar. These challenges have a real effect on real nonprofits. Get in Motion Entrepreneurs is a nonprofit based in the Coachella Valley, California, and they offer seminars on business skills to Spanish-speaking people. They have less than $40,000 in annual revenues and only one full-time staff member, Armando Arenswig. Armando struggles to find time to fill out the dizzying array of applications for these small one-time grants, when what he really wants is a few larger multi-year grants that would enable him to plan ahead. While fundraising is crucial to his organization's survival, he can realistically only fill out so many grant applications a year. All of this limits his ability to deliver on his mission to improve economic opportunities in Latino communities. Okay, so I know this talk has sounded pretty bleak so far, so let's turn our attention to what we can do. I'd like to start by sharing some of the efforts underway at Candid that we hope will equip the social sector with better tools to tackle these challenges. For those of you who haven't heard of Candid, Candid is a nonprofit that was formed only 3 years ago by bringing together two long-standing nonprofits, GuideStar, which has the most comprehensive source of data on US-based nonprofits, and Foundation Center, that has the most comprehensive source of data on foundations and their giving. Together, we now have an unparalleled view of the social sector, with profiles of all operating US-based nonprofits. Our data comes from 3 sources: publicly available data from the IRS in the form of 990s, real-time data sources such as social media, websites, and news, and finally, data that's shared with us directly by foundations and nonprofits themselves. Candid is widely used by funders to learn about organizations working on the issues and geographies that they want to invest in, by nonprofits to identify potential sources of funding, and by researchers to draw insights about trends in the social sector. And it doesn't stop with Candid. The data behind Candid's profiles is also used far and wide by a rich array of partners. This includes giving platforms such as Amazon Smile and Facebook, all the major donor-advised funds, including Fidelity Charitable, and a number of financial institutions. Thus, when a nonprofit shares their information on Candid, that same data is available when anyone looks them up on, say, Volunteer Match or any of our other partners. The Candid profile gives every nonprofit the same ability to share their story and the value that they provide beyond just the basic numbers. Now, while profiles have been around for a long time, we're launching a new initiative called Data 1X to make adoption of profiles ubiquitous by working with foundations, associations, and others to commit to asking nonprofits to share their data one time, or 1X, in a standardized way, in a centralized place where it's accessible by all interested parties. Given the current demand for demographic data and the lack of existing systems to collect it, we're already seeing growing interest from partners to use Candid profiles rather than fielding their own demographic surveys. With Data 1X, our aim is to create a broad coalition committed to these principles, build on our successes with demographic data, and incorporate more and more of the data that's commonly requested in grant applications and ultimately grant reporting. The idea is for all of us to collaborate across the sector to expand our collective knowledge base rather than requesting yet another survey, another application, or another report. Our vision for Data 1X is to relieve the huge unnecessary burden that's been placed on nonprofits and instead put more of the onus on those who are looking for that information. Let's do a deep dive on what Data 1X looks like when it comes to demographic data. I talked earlier about the chaos that ensued when foundations started asking nonprofits to share their demographic data using all sorts of different forms, formats, and definitions. This not only requires nonprofits to fill out a lot of time-consuming forms, but it can also require them to go back and have to resurvey their board and their staff multiple times in order to account for the different slices and categories that organizations are asking for. Of course, all this paperwork imposes a particular burden on smaller, less resourced nonprofits, just the ones that we want to lift up. So how can we do this differently? First, Candid has partnered with experts in the field, such as Change Philanthropy and Equity in the Center, to define a standardized way to collect demographic data that everyone can use. This not only allows us to collect data one time, but also to aggregate and compare data across organizations. Second, under Data 1X, foundations and other stakeholders agree to ask the nonprofits that they work with to complete the demographic section of their Candid profiles rather than fielding their own custom surveys. And finally, nonprofits can simply claim their profile and share their demographic data one time, where the next interested party can simply come and find it. Beyond demographics, nonprofits can share a wide array of information on their Candid profile, including much of what's commonly requested in grant applications. I think of the Candid profile sort of like the equivalent of a nonprofit's LinkedIn profile. As nonprofits complete more and more of their profile, we reward them with seals of transparency to recognize their openness. This starts with a bronze seal when they share their mission and their basic contact information, all the way up to a platinum seal when they're sharing their strategy and success metrics. But by providing all this information one time, nonprofits can increase their visibility and then focus more of their precious time on their important work. Today, over 80,000 nonprofits have active Candid seals. A growing number of foundations and associations are turning to the Candid profile as that single standardized source of information. One great example is the National Diaper Bank, which consists of over 300 community-based nonprofits. 8 years ago, at their national conference, they looked around and recognized that most of the presenters were white women who all came from similar backgrounds and didn't reflect the communities that they were serving. Since that time, the National Diaper Bank has made a concerted effort to better understand the diversity of their network. After numerous attempts to collect this information themselves, last year they decided to ask their members to share their demographic information through Candid. Now, equipped with this data, they've been able to adjust their eligibility criteria to intentionally direct more donations, grants, and capacity building towards BIPOC-led organizations so that they can serve their communities better. Now, while these tools in themselves are only a small step on the journey to equity, we believe that they enable progress by shifting the power dynamics between donors and nonprofits. For nonprofits, sharing data one time lessens their burden, particularly for smaller organizations. It also levels the playing field by giving all nonprofits the same profile summary, the same real estate, and the same ability to be found, regardless of their size or sophistication. For funders, they'll be able to see the demographic makeup of their portfolio, as well as find and lift up organizations that have been historically underrepresented. And they'll have immediate access to rich and current information about nonprofits that can help them in identifying and vetting potential grantees. Across the social sector, this will enable us all to understand broader trends. And I believe that greater transparency will lead to greater trust. Ultimately, better data is the basis for increasing efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. Wow, in putting together this talk, we wanted to give you a sense of how this theory is getting put into practice. And I couldn't think of a better person to do so than an inspiring leader we found right here in Austin, Mimi Stiles, president of Austin-based nonprofit Measure. Mimi, please come up to the stage and join us. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Welcome to Austin.
First, can you tell us, how did you come to your work, and what's the problem you're trying to solve at Measure?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, in the I'm a storyteller, so I have to tell a story, right?
Yes, please.
In the 1960s and the 1970s, my grandfather, he worked between the Black Panther Party and his community in order to build bridges. My father also marched to be called Black and marched for the Black Power movement. Me, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, I was really leading a lot of marches here in Austin, doing a lot of the work in order to fight for Black lives. And so I realized very quickly that I needed to do something a little bit different, and so I created Measure, founded Measure. We are a research and public education organization. We are evaluators, we are data activists that now partner with our community in order to help them increase their data footprint.
That's really impressive. And I'm curious, how did you first hear about Candid's nonprofit profiles?
Yeah, so I have some incredible mentors, right? I have several mentors, but one in particular asked me when I was talking to him about my idea about Measure, what I needed to do, how I needed to get funded, and all of the things that I needed in order to grow. He asked me specifically, do you have your Candid profile? Are you on GuideStar, is what he said at that time. And I said, what do you mean? What is GuideStar? And he says, well, Mimi, go take a look, and it's going to ask you several questions about your mission and the things that you do. And mind you, he's also in the philanthropic community, right? And so I did, and once I got there, I realized I was already there. Because I filed for my 501c3 nonprofit status, I was already there, but what I needed to do was I needed to claim that profile, and so that's how I heard about it.
That's wonderful. So how have you been using Candid profiles in your own work at Measure to advance racial justice?
Yeah, again, Measure is a research organization that is led by Black women. We are led by Black women. I'm going to say that again. We are led
Awesome.
by Black women. And the work that we do at Measure is that we have what's called the CARE model. It's a 12-step process where we partner intentionally with our community, our Black and Brown, powerful Black, Brown, Indigenous-led organizations. And so once we get through that once we get to the end of our 12-step process, we actually orient them to GuideStar, to their Candid profile. We let them know that it is there, and that if they possibly use it, it'll help for them to, to share what their mission is, to share what those metrics are, to share who they are, and actually put them on a national stage for progress. And so that's one, the CARE model is actually one of several tools that we use at Measure, but that one we found has been incredibly powerful to connect organizations to not only their own understanding of their mission and the work that they do, but also to philanthropy.
That's fantastic. So I'm wondering, would you be willing to share an example of a nonprofit that you've worked with at Measure and how claiming their Candid profile has helped them in their work?
Yeah, favorite question by far. So there's several, right? But one in particular, Dr. Courtney Robinson of the Excellence and Advancement Foundation. If you are here in Austin, you know all about her work to dismantle and break the school-to-prison pipeline by intentionally providing direct support and services to Black and Brown children here in Austin. This was my Christmas present. This is, so she texted me around December timeframe, and she says, "Hey, Mimi, thanks so much for walking us through, developing our GuideStar profile. I actually just got a funder that reached out to me because they saw my profile on Candid and granted me $10,000. And so we're continually hearing those types of stories from our community, and to me, I feel like that's the evidence that this work is important, that profile is important, because it is up to us, those that have the ability to create technology or to provide more access to data, et cetera, to actually do justice with our tools. And so to me, in order to address racism, we have to support and fund the organizations that are on the ground, that look like me, that are led by people that look like me, specifically to go do the work.
Wow. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's give a round of applause for Mimi. Wow. Such an inspiring organization and leader. Better data, information, and tools is necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient if we're going to advance racial equity. Equality means that everyone, regardless of background, is given the same opportunity. On the other hand, to achieve equity, we need to go further and recognize and correct for it the impact of historical disadvantages, as well as address ongoing systemic oppression. So how can we use these tools to advance racial equity and unleash the social sector to step up to the challenges of our time? As I mentioned earlier, smaller nonprofits often don't have the resources to create fancy websites or launch social media campaigns. Candid's profile creates a level playing field by giving all nonprofits a consistent and compelling place to tell their story. The profile of a $100,000 nonprofit is largely the same as one for a $100 million nonprofit, and it can be just as easily found. Now, this is an important start. However, to advance racial equity, we need to also find and lift up organizations like the one Mimi talked about, the Excellence and Advancement Foundation, by giving BIPOC leaders the additional boost that they might need through programs like the one Mimi runs at Measure. At Candid, we recognize that just having our tools available on the internet is not enough. Smaller, under-resourced nonprofits may not have the knowledge, the capacity, or even the consistent internet access to really make full use of these tools. So we've partnered with over 300 libraries, colleges, and community centers through our funding information network, where nonprofits can come to a physical location, get assistance from knowledgeable staff, and get free access to Candid's tools. Today, we have poor visibility on the degree to which the leadership, board, and staff at a nonprofit reflects the community that it's trying to serve. Common sense tells us that the people who have the lived experiences and deep community connections are in the best position to understand the problems and create viable solutions. When we don't know who's doing the work, it's impossible to know whether organizations are indeed reflecting the communities that they aim to serve, or to intentionally lift up the ones that do. We need better data. And we need that data in a standardized format, in a central location, and accessible by all. Earlier, I described how the Packard Foundation faced that wake-up call in 2020, which led them to recognize the importance of understanding who it was they were funding. As a result, they explored building their own bespoke tool to collect demographic data on their grantees, where they could ask precisely the questions that they had in mind. But ultimately, they realized it would be more important to take a standardized and centralized approach. And instead, they launched a campaign to encourage all their US-based grantees to complete their Candid profile, including their demographic data. To date, over 34,000 organizations have shared their demographic data on their Candid profile, and the numbers continue to grow. With standardized demographic data, funders will be able to understand who they're investing in across their portfolio. And researchers can start to study whether having or not having diverse leadership has an impact. We simply can't improve what we don't measure. When we have demographic data, we can start to identify important trends. For example, a recent study by the Urban Institute found that people of color are severely underrepresented among nonprofit leadership, amounting to almost half of what you'd expect based on their proportion of the workforce. We also found a gap in both revenues and assets when we compared white-led organizations to those led by people of color. So the upshot is this double whammy. BIPOC leaders represent a disproportionately small number of nonprofit leaders, and among those fewer leaders, their revenues and assets are also smaller. If anything, we should be over-indexing our investments in BIPOC leaders, given the obstacles they face, as well as their understanding of the challenges. This data makes it clear to see why we're not making enough progress. It's unconscionable that we ask already strapped nonprofits to fill out duplicative demographic surveys, complete custom grant applications, and prepare custom reports over and over and over again. This undue burden only serves to perpetuate inequities. If you're a big nonprofit and you have the funding, the capacity, and the staff to service all these donor requests, your competitive advantage becomes playing this game well. On the other hand, if you're a smaller nonprofit and you haven't yet made it, this crush of paperwork becomes effectively a moat that keeps you from even having a chance. So if you're a donor, a foundation, or a nonprofit association, I hope you'll join Data 1X and ask the nonprofits you work with to share their data one time in a standardized format that can be reused by others. And if you're a nonprofit, we hope that you'll complete your Candid profile and take the brave step of asking funders to look there first for the information they're seeking before they ask you again. A couple decades ago, the Common App revolutionized college applications. It's high time we revolutionize the nonprofit experience and unleash a more equitable future. The social sector has a crucial role to play if we're to make progress in advancing racial equity. We're on the front lines. We're an agent for change. We have the trust of our communities. But we must do more. And with better data, we can do more. We have a collective responsibility to both create a level playing field and address the historical injustices that leave some on the sidelines. Together, we can create a social sector that's more efficient, effective, and equitable. So, what would that look like? Let's imagine a different scenario. Rather than putting the equivalent of old-fashioned classified ads out into the ether, what if nonprofits shared their organization, program, and demographic information one time on a public profile? Then funders and other interested parties could simply search for nonprofits that are doing the work, say, in a community such as Austin. And millions of matches could be made immediately to connect donors with the nonprofits who are best positioned to advance our drive for racial equity. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to invite Mimi Stiles back onto the stage, and we're happy to field any questions that you might have. Yes. I think the questions are on the Slido, but if you want to ask loudly, I'll repeat it. Yes?
I'm Luana Genot from Brazil.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Luana Genot from Brazil. I'm the executive director of an organization called IDBR, and we fight for racial justice in the workplace there.
Wow.
We struggle a lot with data because in Brazil, the companies started investing on racial justice just after George Floyd's murdered, but they don't release the data. And there are a lot of companies, US-based, that are also in Brazil. They say that they have global programs for racial equality, but it's only US-based. So my question would be, do you intend to expand Candid work, because we use your data in order to show, okay, we have this great work there and companies investing, so we also need to invest more in racial equality in Brazil. So it would be amazing to have your works also in Latin America, in Brazil, and so on. So that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely, and your struggles are very much I take to heart, because it's so hard when you don't have data to do the work and to shine a light on the importance of, and be able to see what's happening. So the good news is that we are expanding internationally. It will take some time, but we're in the process right now of significantly expanding our database to include millions of nonprofits outside the US as well. And over time, my hope is that the same type of offerings that we have here in Candid in the US will be available in communities around the world, whether directly through us or through partners that we work with in countries who may be in a better position to do so. So stay tuned. We very much are moving in that direction. And again, soon you'll see at least nonprofits come into the Candid tool from around the world, including Brazil. Yeah, I think we're getting some questions in the audience. If we can bring the mic there, maybe we'll. Oh, I see. We had the Brazil question up here already. Let me answer one of the ones on the screen while he gets you the mic. So one of the questions here is: in addition to finding more direct ways to connect, how can corporations get better at authentically supporting nonprofits' work? That's a great question. Do you want to answer that, maybe?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question. You know, there's so much resource that corporations have right now that that can be tapped into, but unfortunately is not, in many cases, because they don't have a disruptor inside of the corporation. So what we do at Measure is always say, become a disruptor, become that voice that may be at the table but not saying anything. Say something. And the best way that we found was like having partnerships with organizations like Kung Fu AI. This is one major corporation here in Austin. Or even, some of the major tech companies here that have people that know how to do data, that know how to disaggregate data, right? So that we can actually highlight the actual issues, the intersections of issues that are out there, and provide them the space to volunteer with organizations like mine, or like with Dr. Courtney Robinson. empower them to get out and use their time in order to give back. And that's a very simple way, I think, for an organization to want to first do better, right? And then second, to actually advance racial justice within their own organization because they're supporting the work on the ground.
Yeah, great answer. I'll just add to that to say, what I would say is a lot of the corporate giving that corporations do, what I find is that corporations, it ends up being more of a PR move, right? Where corporations are giving money to make themselves look good because they're supporting good causes. But there are very few corporations that take the results of their giving as seriously as the results of their business. And what I'd ask is for corporations to, when they're thinking about their giving, demand results and be as oriented towards achieving results as they are in achieving results in their business. And that would, I think, completely change the way that corporations think about their giving.
Hi, my name's Angelique Power, and I ran a foundation in Chicago that focused on racial justice, and I run one in Detroit now. And we've been watching Candid and the work that you've been doing, and really interested in like the BIPOC census survey work that's happening in Detroit. So my question is two-part. One, and I'm sorry if you explained this earlier and I missed it. When you're defining BIPOC-led, are you looking at board in addition to the senior staff or the highest percentage of senior staff? And the second part is, what are some of the challenges that you're running up against from funders? What's the pushback that you're getting about implementing Candid widespread?
No, two great questions. So there isn't one answer about what it means to be BIPOC-led. Every organization has a different definition of that. What we do in collecting demographic data is we collect data about the demographic makeup of both the leadership, the CEO and the senior leadership, the board, and the staff at large. And then each organization can use that data to decide, who do you want to count as BIPOC and who do you want to count as led? Like, does it have to be what percentage? Those are all decisions organizations make for themselves, but with the data being there, they're then able to make those determinations. So our goal is to standardize the data collection, but we're not trying to standardize how people use that data. And then the second part of your question was, funder pushback. We're getting a lot of funders who are really excited about working with us to collect particularly demographic data. I think where we're getting more pushback, and I think it will be slower, is trying to move kind of make more and more of the grant applications go through the Candid profile. And I think a lot of that is just because there's already existing systems that, that are in place that that they're accustomed to. They want to have a lot of control over exactly what they're doing, and they have to let go of a bit of control in order to, use a Candid profile in lieu of their grant application. And so I think that will take more time. I think the reason demographic data has been easier is because most organizations weren't collecting that information before, so they don't have systems already in place and processes already in place that have to be disrupted. They can simply start doing this in a more effective way. Whereas I think where systems already exist, it'll take a little longer for people to make that transition, although some are already doing so.
Good morning.
Yes, hi.
Thank you for being here this morning. In one of your slides that you showed, there was a chart that had whites and BIPOC information, and the left of the graph was a lot of unknown information. So I was just curious of what are some of the approaches or actions that you're taking to uncover that data and make it become unknown data?
Yeah, are you talking about like the pie chart?
Yes.
Yeah. So the pie chart was mostly gray, almost all gray 2 years ago. This is the demographic data that we know about nonprofits, and I think we've now, widened that pie a little bit in the last couple of years, and our goal is to completely fill it in because it's just trying to show how little data we actually have about the nonprofits out there. And so our Data 1X campaign is really geared towards trying to fill in that demographic data, because the reality is going to each nonprofit one by one and saying, please fill out this data, please fill out this data, is very slow, and it'll take a long time for it to get all of that data. So the approach we're trying to take is to shift the ecosystem to make it common best practice that everyone you interact with as a nonprofit, your funders, researchers, nonprofit associations, is going to be looking for your data in your Candid profile, your demographic data in your Candid profile. And so therefore, it makes a lot of sense for you to put it there so you don't have to keep answering all these different surveys. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, and we're trying to get solve the chicken and egg riddle by really launching this campaign to get everyone to ask for the information there so that all the nonprofits put it there one time.
And if I can piggyback on that, Ann Mei,
sure.
just because I think it's important to say, it does take organizations like mine on the ground, to share and to show how positive it is to go onto the Candid website and actually claim your profile. And so we're doing that work in order to support even the work that Candid is doing. And so I really love that question, but it really does lie with the responsibility, first of all, for us to be willing and intentional in sharing with one another too.
I'll take a quick question at the bottom. Are there any recommendation systems integrated into Candid to better match funders to organizations? There's I think numerous. I probably don't know all of them, but one that's well known is Charity Navigator, which also provides recommendations for charities that you might want to donate to and leverages Candid data in doing so. But there's, I think, numerous other ones out there, and really encourage organizations to use our data for that purpose. We don't make recommendations ourselves. We want to sort of stay pure in providing the data as it exists. Let me ask this question to you, Mimi. What other changes have to happen in how nonprofits get funded to make progress on racial equity?
Yeah, great question. Again, gosh, there needs to be this sense of funding for liberation and freedom. When philanthropy gets to a point to where they are actually funding for liberation and freedom, they are doing the work internally, and it is showing because the numbers are changing externally. We know that powerful Black, Brown, Indigenous-led organizations only get a fraction of philanthropic support. And so when we start to see philanthropy doing better, we're going to start seeing the board look different. We're going to start seeing the leadership at the philanthropic organization look different. And then that's going to then translate into organizations like mine actually being able to get through the year. It's going to be organizations like the ones that we support every single day, not having to fund it out of their own pocket, but because they are actually advancing social good on the ground, they're now being funded to do so. So I think it's really a systemic change that has to happen. So many times it's kind of like, okay, well, the organization is not ready or equipped in XYZ. And that's not typically the case, because the thing is that we've been doing this work, and we'll do this work even without funding, to be honest with you. But with funding, we know that we can go further, we can go faster, we can do it together, and that's actually how we work.
Yeah, great answer. I would also say, we focused today, just because we're candid, and the topic of this conversation, we focused on data. But there's a lot of other things beyond data that we think really need to shift in the way nonprofits and donors work with each other. And there's a movement, I think, that's gained a lot of momentum in the last couple of years around some principles of trust-based philanthropy that I think really tried to shift the power dynamics more significantly between nonprofits and donors that we think are really important in helping us make more progress on racial equity. And so the difference is, traditionally, that donors will put out a RFP or select a nonprofit to work with, have them do all the work to fill out grant applications, put together work plans and so forth. And then the relationship of a grant is often highly restricted. So that what that means is that there's a really detailed budget, there's a detailed work plan, and you basically have to go and just execute religiously to that work plan. And as you can imagine, the situation on the ground is highly dynamic, and problems, you have to try lots of things to figure out what's going to work. And so having such a rigid system where donors are essentially micromanaging the nonprofits that they work with is not an effective way to do great work. I've talked to a number of nonprofits who have gotten big grants from nonprofits to do work. They put their best proposal forward, and they realized partway through that whatever they were doing wasn't working. And they just kept doing it anyway. I mean, they didn't want me to tell any, I'm not going to name names, but they felt like they needed to keep doing that work because they wanted to preserve the relationship with the funder. And even though it wasn't actually solving the problem they're trying to solve, I mean, that is such a sad state of affairs. And so I think with trust-based philanthropy, the top line thrust is to try to get more donations to be general operating support or unrestricted funding, which is basically how companies get funded, right? When you invest in a company, you don't say you have to spend this penny here and you have to do this task here. You say, we're making this investment, we trust you, let's work together to deliver great results. And if they don't succeed, then you can decide not to invest in them more. I think the same thing should be true with nonprofits. If you're gonna work with a nonprofit, trust them, give them unrestricted funding or general operating support, and agree on what goals you're trying to achieve. And if for whatever reason, you don't feel like they're delivering well, you can decide not to fund them further, but allow them the flexibility to make those choices day in and day out to respond to the evolving needs. And the good news is that we saw a lot of progress towards this in the last couple years because the pandemic sort of forced all these kind of rigid grant agreements to get blown up because all those things you said you were going to do, you couldn't do anymore. And so a lot of funders really relaxed those restrictions during COVID. And my hope is that that will continue to persist beyond.
And can I say too, people over program. When the funder is really seeking to dismantle racism, start with the people first. Fund people. Organizations that are doing the work on the ground really need people. And so in many cases, it's volunteer-based and volunteer work. But when we actually have, a person that is in charge of work that is actually being paid and funded to do so, we're able to really do the work. And so people over programming, and then also remembering that our consistency is our credit. A lot of times we don't have the infrastructure or the big dashboards and everything to prove our impact right away when we're first doing the work, but see the consistency, see that the years that that certain funder or that certain founders have put into advancing social justice within their community, and use that as as that trust-based philanthropy is advanced in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at the other questions here. I think we answered the one about what work you're doing to see Candid adopted by funders and grant providers. Most of them are already using Candid, just to be clear. Most funders and grant providers are already using Candid to identify nonprofits to invest in and to do research on the nonprofits and to vet those nonprofits. I think a further step that we're hoping to have these funders and grant makers take is not only to do their research there, but to use the data there in lieu of their custom grant applications, demographic surveys, and reporting over time, or at least to use the information that's there as the basis of it and ask only additional information that isn't already there. Yes, Jessica, share with us more what you're asking. Do we have a mic?
Thank you. I was also wondering if this could also be a hub to gather other metrics that might be helpful, right, that can provide guidance to either understanding what's working, right? Does this platform and the connections they are making help to bolster, the organizations and what change we're seeing, as people begin to make more connections and there's more visibility and all of that?
So you're talking about the impact of the connections that are being made. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we want to do more research about. We don't have visibility a lot of times in terms of the connections that get made because we're not a donation platform, so people don't transact on our platform. So a lot of times we don't know sort of when those connections get made. So it's great to talk to Mimi to hear some of these anecdotal examples of where those connections are happening. But that's something I think we'd like to do more research about. The other thing that I was wondering if you were asking about is understanding the outcomes and results of nonprofits. And that's something that we are starting to ask for in the Platinum Seal, so that we start to ask nonprofits to report what are the outcomes you're seeking and what are the, and tracking your progress against those outcomes each year. And that's something that I'd love for us to continue to invest in and get more sophisticated in. It's a little bit of a holy grail. I think it's not as easy to measure outcomes and results for nonprofits by far than it is for corporations, where you can just count the dollars. But it's something I think we need to get increasingly better at, and we're continuing to make progress on, and we want to capture that information on the Candid profile to help any donor really better assess and understand what nonprofits what any particular nonprofit is been successful in delivering. What are good ways to add community voices into the grant-making process?
I'd love to answer that question. And I'll start with a quick story. So Measure just, last year we actually partnered with a major foundation here in Austin. It's called the Austin Community Foundation. And they were doing a lot of work to understand how their funds for their women's fund was being used within the city. And what they found was that although they had the women's fund and most of the work was centered in supporting the BIPOC community, most of the organizations that were getting their funding was actually to folks that were not led by organizations that were from the BIPOC community, right? And so Measure used one of our tools called the Equity Focus Group tool in order to support that process, their relearning and their reimagining of creating new grants and RFPs, and we were successful because they were able to push over $400,000 into the hands of powerful Black and brown women that are actually leading the work in Austin. And so I think that's what you do, is that you ask. Just ask, right? And do it in a way that truly elevates their voices. But that's not enough. You have to take that feedback and you have to actually implement systemic change within your grant-making process. And so I think that is just a really good example of what it looks like to actually add community voices into the grant-making process. This should be their grant, for them, by them. And if it's not, then that means it's not actually going to do the work that we intend it to do.
Yeah, it's a great answer, Mimi. There's a initiative called Listen for Good that's really encouraging funders to listen, and nonprofits to listen to the people that they're hoping to serve. And surprisingly, it's not something that's always done, right? If you're a company and you're selling a product, you get immediate feedback from your customers because they either buy your product or not. And it's a much simpler transaction because you have the provider of your company that's providing the product, and you have a customer that's buying the product. With nonprofits, it's actually a three-way transaction where there's usually a funder funding a nonprofit and then a nonprofit providing a product or service to the community. And so there's no feedback loop, right? Because the communities, they're not paying for the product necessarily, so you're not hearing back from them whether what you're providing is actually something they want at all. And there's all sorts of ridiculous situations where nonprofits can end up providing things to a community that really aren't wanted or even counterproductive. So it's really important for us to listen to the people that we are aiming to serve and get that feedback and incorporate that feedback into what we're doing. Thank you guys so much for being with us this morning.